If someone told you that the internet, with all of its complex code, fiber optic cables, and massive global networking, was invented by a single person living in a remote, completely off-the-grid cabin in the woods.
Right, yeah. You wouldn't buy it for a second.
You'd say that's logically impossible. I mean, a system that's sophisticated, that culturally disruptive, it has to come from a highly connected environment, right?
Well, it needs infrastructure.
Exactly. It needs decades of previous discoveries, arguments, and technology to build upon. Well, welcome to today's deep dive, where we are taking that exact same logic and applying it to one of the most historically misunderstood events of all time.
And we're talking about the origins of Islam.
Yes. Our mission today, for you, the listener, is to reconstruct the intense, incredibly high-stakes world of late antiquity, specifically the 3rd to 7th centuries CE. We want to step into the exact environment that the Qur'an actually entered.
Which is a vital reconstruction to make, honestly. Primarily because the popular imagination has held on to a very specific and frankly very inaccurate picture of this era for centuries.
Yeah, we like our neat little historical boxes.
We do. We really do. We tend to view history in these isolated boxes, and that has severely distorted our understanding of this particular movement.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to picture 7th century Arabia. If you ask most people to describe what that looked like, they usually imagine this vast, empty, isolated desert.
Right, just sand dunes?
Yeah, just a quiet, barren place filled with purely pagan nomads who are completely cut off from global civilization.
Which is a deeply ingrained myth. I mean, historically, later traditions often referred to this pre-Islamic period as the Jahila.
Which translates to what exactly?
It roughly translates to the age of ignorance. The implication there was that Arabia was this cultural and spiritual dark room before the light suddenly turned on.
Like nothing was happening at all.
Exactly. But the academic sources and the historical records we are looking at today, they completely shatter that myth. Arabia was absolutely not an empty cabin in the woods.
Not even close.
No. It was essentially the ultimate geopolitical buffer zone of the ancient world.
And, I mean, a buffer zone implies there are things that need buffering. We're talking about massive superpowers here, right?
We are. You have to visualize the map of late antiquity. Up to the north and northwest, you have the Christian Byzantine Empire.
Right, the surviving half of the Roman Empire.
Exactly. Then to the east, you have the Zoroastrian, Sasanian Persian Empire. And down in the south, traversing Yemen and the Red Sea, there's the Kingdom of Aksum.
Which was Ethiopian, right?
Yes, a powerful Ethiopian empire heavily involved in the region's trade and politics. So Arabia was sandwiched directly in the middle of these exhausted, warring superpowers.
Wow.
It was loud, it was incredibly dangerous, and its people were deeply plugged into the global events of the time.
I feel like if we want to understand a new religious movement, we first have to understand the baseline mood of the people it's speaking to. And from the sources we've pulled, the mood in the 6th century wasn't just anxious, it was utter existential terror.
Oh, absolutely.
You're reading these accounts and the environment sounds literally post-apocalyptic.
Yeah. Historians often look at the year 536 CE as a global reset. And arguably one of the worst times to be alive in human history.
Wait, really? What happened in 536?
There was a massive volcanic eruption, likely in the northern hemisphere, that threw a thick veil of ash across the atmosphere.
Oh, wow.
We are talking about a literal dark age. Historical accounts say the sun gave off light like the moon for over a year.
That is horrifying.
It gets worse. This triggered a mini ice age, massive global crop failures, and devastating plagues that wiped out millions. People were starving, dying of disease, and the sky was quite literally dark.
You're essentially describing the plot of a dystopian survival movie. If the crops die and a massive plague hits, people on the ground genuinely think the world is ending.
Without a doubt.
And then, human nature being what it is, instead of banding together to survive this environmental nightmare, the empires decide to start a world war.
They absolutely tore each other apart. All of this environmental and economic tension culminated in a brutal, grinding 26-year war.
26 years.
From 602 to 628 CE. Between the Romans and the Persians. This was the World War III of the ancient world.
So not just border skirmishes then?
No, total devastation. Jerusalem was besieged and sacked by the Persians. The true cross, which was considered one of the absolute holiest relics in all of Christianity, was physically stolen and taken to Persia.
I can't even imagine the psychological impact of that.
It was massive. Even Constantinople, the seemingly impenetrable capital of the Roman Empire, was besieged. The psychological toll on the average person living in the Near East at this time was completely incomprehensible.
I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. The climate has collapsed, there's a plague, and the two biggest superpowers are fighting a death match where holy cities are burning. How does all of this political dread connect to the actual text of the Qur'an?
It's a great question.
Because usually we think of scripture as dealing with, timeless, abstract spiritual concepts, not necessarily the morning news.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Quran isn't just floating in a spiritual vacuum. It actively comments on this specific geopolitical nightmare.
Really? Where?
There's a chapter, Surah Ar-Rum, which translates directly to the Romans. In it, the text actually discusses this devastating Roman defeat, but it predicts a Roman comeback within a few years.
That is wild.
It's delivering this prophecy at a time when pretty much everyone in the region thought the Byzantine Empire was completely finished.
So it's stepping right into the middle of the global political discourse.
Exactly. And the renowned scholar Fred Donner takes this analysis a step further. He argues that early Islam functioned as what he calls a believers' movement.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means it was an intense apocalyptic movement focused entirely on moral urgency and saving souls before the imminent last hour. When you read the earliest chapters of the Quran, the imagery is visceral and terrifying.
Like what kind of imagery?
It talks about the sun being wrapped up in darkness, the stars falling from the sky, the mountains turning to dust and blowing away.
Wait, so to the people living through the 536 CE ash clouds and the endless wars, that imagery wasn't just poetic metaphor. That matched the reality they were actually living through.
Precisely. The apocalyptic tone resonated because it validated their lived experience. They had already seen the sun darkened and their societies collapse.
Okay, so with the Romans and Persians bleeding their treasuries dry in this literal world war, who is actually guarding the borders of Arabia, they can't possibly be fighting each other in Jerusalem and simultaneously policing the massive desert to the south.
They couldn't. The empires outsourced the job.
Oh, of course they did.
Yeah, they used powerful Arab tribes as proxy armies to manage that buffer zone. The Byzantines allied themselves with an Arab Christian kingdom known as the Ghassanids. Meanwhile, the Persians allied with a different Arab kingdom called the Lakhmids.
And these weren't just small tribes, right?
I cannot overstate how sophisticated these groups were. They were not simple wandering nomads. They built sprawling palaces. They funded cutting-edge poetry. Their leaders wore imperial crowns. And they spent decades fighting proxy wars on behalf of Rome and Persia.
So they were the highly paid security forces of the ancient world.
Exactly.
But according to the historical timeline, right before Islam emerges, something drastic happens to these kingdoms.
The empires made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. The Byzantines and the Persians were completely broke from their 26-year world war.
Right, wars are expensive.
Extremely. They looked at the massive payroll they were sending to these Arab buffer kingdoms and decided they simply couldn't afford it anymore.
You're kidding?
Nope. So driven by financial exhaustion and political paranoia, they dismantled the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids. They just cut the funding and broke the alliances.
Let me make sure I'm picturing this right. It sounds like a bank looking at a budget deficit and deciding to save money by dismantling its own high-tech vault doors and firing all the armed guards right before a massive hurricane hits.
Yes. They were completely blind to the threat they were creating for themselves.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. By destroying the institutional structures of the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, the empires instantly created a massive, chaotic power vacuum in northern Arabia.
Because the people didn't just disappear.
Right. Think about what was left behind. You now had all these Arab tribes who had spent generations fighting imperial proxy wars. They were highly trained in Roman and Persian military tactics. They were heavily armed with top-tier imperial weapons, but suddenly they were completely leaderless. They were just sitting in this massive power vacuum, culturally unified but politically fractured, waiting for a unifying force.
And it feels like this is the exact moment our narrative shifts from purely political history to theological history. Because these heavily armed, highly trained tribes weren't just sitting around looking for a new politician to pay them.
No, they weren't.
They were deeply, passionately engaged in the massive religious debates of the day. They were. And the physical evidence for this is literally carved into the landscape. If we examine the thousands of rock inscriptions scattered across the Arabian desert, which historians often describe as the social media of the 6th century, we find something incredible.
What's on the rocks?
The names Allah and Ar-Rahman, which means the merciful, are carved into these rocks long before the formal arrival of Islam. Arabia already possessed a very deep, established monotheistic undercurrent.
Really? So it wasn't all paganism?
Far from it. Down in southern Arabia, the kingdom of Himyar was ruled by Jewish kings in the 4th and 5th centuries. And across the northern tribes, you had Arab Christian bishops deeply embedded in the local culture.
I'm stuck on something here, though. I've always thought of the Roman Empire at this point as being entirely unified under Christianity. So why was the desert suddenly filling up with all these religious factions? Weren't they all on the same page?
Not even close. Christianity in late antiquity was tearing itself apart in a massive, incredibly bitter theological civil war. The entire debate centered on the exact, precise nature of Jesus. The official Byzantine church, backed by the emperor, argued that Jesus had two natures, fully human and fully divine.
Okay.
But then you had the Syriac monophysites, who fiercely argue he had one combined nature. And then the Nestorians had a completely different third perspective.
Why did the Roman government care so much about this, though? I mean, why couldn't they just let people believe what they wanted?
Because in late antiquity, religious unity was political unity. If you disagreed with the emperor's official theology, you weren't just a religious dissenter, you were a political traitor.
Oh, so it was a state security issue.
Exactly. The Byzantine authorities branded these dissenting groups as heretics. Their churches were seized, their books were burned, and their leaders were violently exiled from the empire.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the official church is kicking all these people out, and they literally cannot stay in Roman territory, they have to go somewhere.
They do.
They need a safe haven outside the reach of the Byzantine secret police. Did they just pour into the Arabian desert?
They absolutely did. Arabia, being this massive, decentralized buffer zone, became the ultimate safe haven. The desert quickly filled with exiled monks, fugitive hermits, and highly educated Christian sects.
Wow.
And they didn't just bring their beliefs, they brought their libraries. They carried what we now call apocryphal texts. These were essentially the director's cut gospels, stories, and texts that the official Byzantine church had thrown out of the canon.
So, pre-Islamic Arabia wasn't an isolated wasteland at all. It was a vibrant, crowded, incredibly tense melting pot of competing, exiled religious ideas.
Precisely.
Which totally shifts the paradigm of how we have to view the Qur'an. I mean, how does a brand new religious text handle walking into this crowded, chaotic room filled with exiled Christians and Jewish tribes who have been aggressively arguing with each other for decades?
It's a fascinating dynamic. Scholar Angelica Neuwirth proposes a really elegant framework for understanding this. She argues that the Qur'an didn't merely copy biblical texts, which is a common misconception. Instead, it engaged in an active interpretive dialogue. Rather than just repeating ancient history, the Qur'an steps right into the middle of this specific theological civil war, acting almost like a judge clearing a crowded table.
So it's actively giving a verdict on the debates of the day.
Yes. A perfect example is how the Qur'an treats Jesus. It deeply honors him, calling him a massive prophet, and specifically refers to him as a spirit and a word from God. But it aggressively addresses the sectarian violence that was tearing the Christian world apart.
How does it do that?
In Surah 4, verse 171, the text explicitly says, "Do not say three." It is directly, surgically telling these warring factions to stop the very Trinitarian debate that got them exiled into the desert in the first place.
That is so direct. It's also doing something really clever with the popular culture of the time, too. The Quran retells stories that you won't find in the standard canonical Bible, but were massively popular in those apocryphal texts those exiled monks brought with them.
Right, the director's cut stories.
Yeah. It references Jesus speaking perfectly from the cradle, or taking clay birds and breathing life into them. And the most striking example is how it handles the legend of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus.
That is a vital story to look at. The 7 Sleepers was essentially a massive, trending 6th century Christian blockbuster. It was the story of a group of righteous youths who hid in a cave to escape persecution and miraculously slept for 300 years.
It's a great story.
It is. And the Quran takes this highly viral story and remixes it in a chapter called Surah Al-Kahf.
But it doesn't just retell it, right? I was reading this part of the source material and it's fascinating. The Quran outright refuses to confirm the basic trivia of the story.
Exactly.
People were obsessively arguing over exactly how many sleepers were in the cave, and the Quran basically says, some say 3, some say 5, only God knows. It's like taking a trending piece of viral pop culture that everyone on the internet is fighting over and using it to make a totally different, much deeper point.
It's shifting the focus.
Right. It's telling the audience, you are completely missing the moral of the story by endlessly arguing over the map.
It elevates the discourse. And the Quran goes even further to resolve the foundational tension between Judaism and Christianity. It essentially bypasses their entire conflict by framing Abraham as a pure, original monotheist.
Oh, clever.
It resets the theological timeline. By arguing that Abraham existed long before the Torah and long before the Gospel, the Quran presents an earlier, universal devotion to one God. It's a profound theological maneuver that undercuts the exclusivity claims of the warring factions.
Okay, I understand the theology, but this brings up a massive practical, mechanical question for me.
Sure.
If the Quran is delivering these incredibly sophisticated, surgical, theological arguments, stepping into debates about the nature of Jesus and the limits of human knowledge, how on earth is this going viral?
Oh.
We are talking about a culture that doesn't have printing presses or mass-produced books. How does a message this complex physically spread across a massive desert?
Well, to understand the mechanics of that spread, we have to look closely at the DNA of the Arabic language itself. If you trace the historical origins of the Arabic alphabet, it doesn't actually begin in Mecca or Medina.
Where does it come from?
The script traces its roots far to the north, to Petra and the Nabatean civilization in modern-day Jordan. By the time we reached the 7th century, the language had evolved into a highly sophisticated coin, which is a common unifying dialect.
Like a lingua franca.
Yes. Think of it as a rich Shakespearean High Arabic. Even if different tribes had their own local slang for everyday life, every single tribe in the desert deeply understood and revered this high register of Arabic.
And the early written script of this language had a mechanical quirk that just blows my mind. It had no dots.
Yes, the skeletal script.
Right. In modern Arabic, dots distinguish the letters. But back then, a single swooping line could be a B, a T, or an N, which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was an oral-first culture, right? You literally couldn't just sit down and silently read a scroll unless you already had the text memorized and knew what it was supposed to sound like. It would be like looking at complex sheet music without knowing the tune.
That is a superb analogy. The text was merely a mnemonic device to jog the memory. Poetry was their internet. It was their news broadcasting network, their historical archive, and their political propaganda machine.
It was everything.
Everything. The great ancient market of Ukaz, near Mecca, wasn't just a place to trade baits, leather, and camels. It was the site of massive, highly competitive poetry slams. The poets were the rock stars and journalists of the ancient Arab world, capable of memorizing tens of thousands of lines.
Unbelievable.
It was a society entirely built on and hypersensitive to the raw power of the spoken word.
So what does this all mean? I have to push back here, or at least ask the obvious question. If these tribes spend their entire lives evaluating elite, complex poetry at these massive markets, why didn't they just clap when they heard the Quran? If it was just good Arabic, why didn't they give it a high score, say great poem, and move on? Why was it immediately seen as such a massive societal threat?
This raises an important question, and it is the absolute key to understanding the Quran's initial explosive impact. Historians and linguists describe what happened in Mecca as linguistic shock.
Linguistic shock?
Yeah. The very word Qur'an literally translates to the recitation. When the Arabs heard it spoken aloud, it didn't fit into any of their established mental boxes. It didn't follow the strict, rigid, metrical rules of standard poetry, which they called shir.
But it also wasn't just normal, everyday talking.
Correct. And it also wasn't Saj.
What's Saj?
Saj was a specific type of rhymed, rhythmic prose used exclusively by tribal soothsayers, fortune tellers, and mystics. The Quran borrowed the mesmerizing, hypnotic cadence of Saj, but instead of mumbling about finding lost camels or lifting minor tribal curses, it delivered the profound, terrifying, sweeping content of biblical prophecy and global apocalypse.
Wow, so it completely broke their linguistic operating system.
It was a completely new, disruptive literary genre. It essentially hacked the Arab ear. The critics in Mecca were deeply, genuinely confused by it. When you read the historical accounts, they accused the prophet of being a poet one day, a madman the next, and a sorcerer the day after that.
Because they couldn't label it.
Exactly. They threw these labels at him simply because they lacked the cultural and linguistic vocabulary to categorize what they were hearing. The Quran used their shared, deeply revered language to deliver a message they had zero cultural defense against.
Pulling all of these incredible threads together for you, the listener The birth of Islam was definitively not a quiet, isolated event in an empty, ignorant desert. It was an almost impossible convergence of historical dominoes.
A perfect storm.
It really was. It required a geopolitical apocalypse and climate disaster that terrified the entire known world. It required the catastrophic financial mistake of the Roman and Persian empires dismantling their own buffer kingdoms, which created a massive, heavily armed power vacuum. It required a desperate audience of exiled, highly educated religious refugees who had fled into the desert carrying alternate gospels. And finally, it required a devastatingly effective linguistic tool, this High Arabic, to spread a message that hacked the culture's oral internet.
And there's one final piece of historical context that beautifully, physically illustrates this massive convergence. When the early Muslims first began to pray as a community, their Qibla, their physical direction of prayer, was not toward Mecca.
Wait, really?
They initially prayed facing north, toward Jerusalem.
Wow, which sends a very clear, undeniable message to everyone watching.
It signaled absolute intentional continuity with the biblical traditions of the Jews and the Christians. They were visually and physically aligning themselves with the deep monotheistic history of the wider region.
Right.
The eventual shift of the Qibla southward toward Mecca, specifically to the Kaaba, was a massive turning point. It wasn't just a physical pivot. It was a geopolitical and spiritual declaration of absolute independence.
A clean break.
Yes. It was the exact moment the movement declared it was returning to the pure, original faith of Abraham, completely distinct from the toxic, warring factions of late antiquity.
And that message of a pure reset was laser targeted at a very specific demographic living in Arabia at the time, known as the Hanifs.
Ah, yes, the Hanifs.
Think of the Hanifs as the ultimate spiritual but not religious demographic of the 7th century. They were independent seekers who knew the local pagan idols were meaningless, but they looked at the violent, burning book sectarian politics of the Byzantine Christians and the local Jewish tribes and said, "We want absolutely no part of your institutional baggage."
The Hanifs were searching for exactly what the Qur'an was offering. A pure return to Abrahamic monotheism, entirely stripped of the corrupting influence of the exhausted empires.
When you lay all these pieces out on the board, it leaves you with a really profound thought. Think back to that remote cabin we talked about at the very beginning. If things had been calm, if the empires had just peacefully coexisted, if the climate hadn't violently collapsed in 536, would any of this have happened?
It's a fascinating counterfactual.
Right. When you consider that this faith required the literal collapse of neighboring empires, devastating global plagues, and a terrifying end-of-the-world climate just to take root, it makes you wonder, could a movement of this magnitude ever have succeeded in times of peace and prosperity? Or is absolute human desperation the ultimate, unavoidable catalyst for a spiritual revolution?